Good morning and welcome to Sunday School at Second Baptist. I'm glad you could join me. I we are going to continue in our study of First Kings, and this week we're going to be in chapter 15. So if you want to follow along in your Bible, I'm going to give you a little background before we go into oh no, I'm sorry. You know what? I said the wrong chapter. I'm going back to reference something. We're actually in chapter 18 this week. Chapter 18 of First Kings. Okay, we'll get on the right page in a minute. So I wanted to go back and give a little history that I didn't give last week because it supports what we're going to talk about this week. So that's what I'm going to do now. You remember that Israel was divided into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and then Judah. So the northern kingdom was called Israel, and then the other kingdom was referenced as Judah a lot of times, but it was actually the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And so the story that we have today is from something that happened with that northern kingdom as as things progressed then. And so what happened, you remember that Jeroboam was the first leader of that northern kingdom when they split off. And then his son Nadab became the king after him. And he reigned for 2 years, and then a general from his army named Baasha came in and took over, had a coup or whatever, and wiped out all of Jeroboam's family, all the relatives that could have possibly inherited the throne, that could have possibly come back and said, oh, well, no, the throne belonged to our family and I'm going to take it over now. So he wiped out everybody. So that was Baasha. And then he reigned for an amount of time. He was also following an evil example, is what it says. And then his son Elah, E-L-A-H, came onto the throne. And he only reigned 2 years. And then one of his military leaders, named Zimri, killed him and became the king. And Zimri did just like the other guy did. He went and he wiped out all of Baasha's entire household and relatives and anybody that could have made a claim on the throne. Zimri reigned for only then 7 days, and one of his army commanders, Omri, O-M-R-I, began to make a move to take over, and when that happened, Zimri committed suicide. So Omri reigned for 12 years over Israel, and he, did the same sorts of things that other people did. One of the things he did, though, was he established Samaria as the capital of the northern kingdom. So that was one of the things he did while he was in there. And then when Omri died, his son Ahab took over the throne. And you may have heard Ahab's name because he was notorious. If the rest of them weren't bad, Ahab was really notorious. And so that's where we're going to pick up then from today, because Ahab then, when he became the king, he was, we've heard his name many times about how evil he was. And he was the one that married Jezebel, who was a princess from Sidon, and she was a worshiper of Baal. And so, in the course of time, and you can see all of this, you can read through all of this in Kings and Chronicles. But what Jezebel did then, one of the things she did was to kill all the prophets of God. She wanted to wipe them all out. And a guy named Obadiah saved 100 prophets and hid them in a cave and fed them and helped them to stay alive. So during this time then, the prophet Elijah appeared on the scene. So Jezebel had tried to kill everybody, but somehow then this prophet Elijah appears. And we're going to see some of the things that Elijah did today. So Elijah went to Ahab and told him that, you're doing wrong. Elijah was a bold person, and you see that throughout this. And so he went to Ahab, told him, that he was doing wrong by having these temples and altars and things to Baal, and also he had gone along with the Asheroth and had those, the worship going also. I think Jezebel was in both of those, and so he had gone right along with that. And so we pick up then in 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 25. So let me get over there and we'll go with that. So at the beginning of this, Elijah had gone and he had talked to Ahab and said, I'm going to prove to you that God is the real God. The God that I follow is the real God. And so what I want you to do is I want you to get 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of the Asherah and bring them to me at Mount Carmel. And so this is the setting then. This is one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament. We as children we heard this in Sunday school. It was very memorable. And so Ahab sends this message and gathers up the prophets of Baal and gets them to Mount Carmel. And then Elijah comes there, and it says here in verse 20 now, or 21 is where I am. Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him." But the people did not answer a word. Okay, so I get the scene now that here is Elijah has come, the 450 prophets of Baal have come, and it says Elijah came near to the people. So we know that people had come to watch what was about to happen. The word went around that, something big is happening. Let's all go see what it is. But you can imagine if there was going to be a showdown between these prophets, that the people were not close up then. It wasn't like a schoolyard fight where everybody rings around and they're right up there. I mean, they may have been up on the hills, around the edges, trying to watch and see what was happening. So Elijah goes over to them, and this is what he says, if God is God, follow him, and if Baal is the God, then follow him, and we're going to choose today what's going to happen. So now we're at verse 25. So we've set the scene. So in verse 25, so Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one ox for yourselves and prepare it first, for you are many, and call on the name of your God. but put no fire under it. I'm just going to read on to the next verse. Then they took the ox which was given them, and they prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. Okay, so this is how it starts. They prepare themselves at a little altar there, or I guess it was a big altar because they put a bull on it. They put the wood, they put the bull, and then they began to call out to Baal. And you can imagine this is 450 of them, and it doesn't mention whether or not the 400 prophets of the Asherah also came for this. So, I'm not going to mention them again either. They could have been there as well. But let's say 450 people in one place is a large group. And they're all calling out to Baal, and they're all, dancing around the altar or whatever they were doing. And they did this from morning until noon, saying, Oh, Baal, answer us. But there was no answer. And then I'm going on now. And they leaped about the altar which they made. It came about at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, Call out with a loud voice, for he is a god. Either he is occupied or gone aside, or is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and needs to be awakened. So now Elijah is taunting them or mocking them, I guess, and saying these things. Yell louder, they're jumping around, they're doing whatever they can. He's saying, yell louder. Maybe he's gone away, or he's asleep, or, he went on a journey, or he's preoccupied with something else, And so they cried, in verse 28 now is where I am. They cried with a loud voice and cut themselves according to their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out on them. Okay, that's verse 28. Now this was something that really stood out to me on that verse, because they began cutting themselves, and the blood was flowing, and this was supposed to get their God's attention better. And it reminded me that there's many verses in the Bible where it says the devil seeks to destroy. He roams about like a ravaging lion, seeking whom he can destroy, and that sort of thing. And when you see these guys beginning to cut themselves and to destroy their bodies, basically, for their God that they're, following, then, you realize that the devil, in every way possible, is just trying to destroy more people. And we see that even today at times with people who, I don't guess you see it as much in the U.S., but overseas, like in India and places where you see where people have mutilated themselves and done things to try to please the idols that they worship and things like that. Okay, now let's go on. I've stopped on verse 28. Let me find my place, and we'll go to 29. When midday was past, they raved until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. But there was no voice, no one answered, and no one paid attention. So, no response from Baal, that they were trying to serve. Okay, so now it's Elijah's turn. Then Elijah said to all the people, Come near me. So all the people came near him. Okay, so you can imagine the scene of maybe they begin to come down from the hills and come closer, to where Elijah is. And he repaired the altar of the Lord which had been torn down. So you remember when the temple was built, then God said, worship me in the place that I've designated for my name, and don't worship me on every hill and mountain or whatever. but this altar probably had been there from long ago. And then this, Elijah wasn't doing wrong to be here. This was a special event, we'll call it. It was a one-time thing where Elijah brought them out there. It wouldn't have been appropriate for him to bring the prophets of Baal to the temple and say, okay, sacrifice your animal here. That would not have been appropriate. So he's brought them to one of the high places, what we call the high places. Okay, so Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the sons of Jacob, of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, Israel shall be your name. So, in building this altar back up, Elijah does that with 12 stones. And as he's doing that, I can imagine that he is talking and saying, maybe this stone is for the tribe of whoever. He may have done something like that, or he may have just commented on the 12 stones, or maybe they just observed that. But he was making a point by doing the 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes. And what Elijah was doing in this was trying to show them that God had not forgotten them, even though they had forgotten God. They had turned to other gods. But God had not forgotten them, and that Israel as a people was still one people. And that I never really thought of this story in that way in times past when I've read it. I've not really focused on that aspect of it. And the fact that they had gone away from God, and of course we do focus on that part, and then God was trying to bring them back. But the idea of this visible showing that the nation of Israel was one, and though they were divided, this was not God's desire for them to be divided like this, because they were his chosen people, and he was still watching over both sides. When we think about the tribe of Judah, or the nation of Judah, if you want to call it that way, the division though, but Judah, and then we think of Israel and them fighting against each other. Maybe we take sides. Maybe we say, oh, well, we've got to be on the side of Judah when they fight, because that's the lineage, of David. But in truth, the whole nation of Israel is what God looked at, and those were his chosen people. And so he did not desire for them to fight at any time. But when they did, I'm sure that it was not God's plan for them. So anyway, let me get back on the on the lesson now. So with the stones, he built an altar in the name of the Lord. And he made a trench around the altar large enough to hold 2 measures of seed. In the book, I think it says approximately 3 gallons of water could have been held in that. But 2 measures of seed is what it says in mine. And 1 measure of seed is approximately 11 quarts. So that's about, well, you figure it, do the math. That's about 3 gallons by itself. So maybe it was more than that. Then he arranged the wood and cut the ox in pieces and laid it on the wood. Okay, so he's got his own altar built now, and he's got the ox laid up there on it with the wood, and he's dug this trench around the altar. And then he says to the people that are there, in verse 34, fill 4 pitchers with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. So they've got these pitchers of water now, and they're pouring it on the wood. and on the offering, on the altar. And he said, do it a second time. And they did it a second time. And he said, do it a third time. And they did it a third time. The water flowed around the altar, and he also filled the trench with water. So he wet down the wood. He wet down everything that was there, is so much so that it came out, and then he continued and filled up that trench with water. Okay, then we'll go on to verse 36. At the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet came near. Now, when it says came near, I'm saying he came near to the people and near to the sacrifice. So these people are gathered all around. And he said, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. So there he's saying, rather than saying Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which I think he had said earlier, he now puts the word Israel. And, Jacob and Israel, that is the same person. But now he's using the name Israel. Today, let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their heart back again. I like the way he said that, because he kept the emphasis on trying to show them that God was God, not trying to show them that Elijah was powerful. And that's so important, because in that moment, if you were Elijah, he was you might call him a powerful prophet. He wasn't really powerful in himself, was he? It was God who did the powerful things that Elijah, is sometimes credited with. And so he wasn't trying to emphasize anything of himself. He was trying to emphasize God's power in that moment. Do these things, God, to show that you are God and that you have turned their heart back again. Okay, now in verse 38. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. So this fire of the Lord fell on the offering. I don't know if it was like a lightning bolt or like a what do you call those things, that a blowtorch, was it like that? I don't know, but it fell from God. So we know it came from above and down. We can kind of picture that in the form of fire and consumed. So just like took away or burned up or disintegrated everything, not just the wood, which was wet, and the ox, but also the stones were completely obliterated, and the dust, it says, so some of the dirt maybe, and licked up the water that was in the trench. So all the water that was extra water, it just soaked it all up. When all the people, this is verse 39 now, when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. Now that's where our lesson ends. And then you go on from there, and we're gonna, our next lesson is gonna pick up shortly after this. So you may want to read on ahead in the next, couple of chapters, and you'll be ready for next week. But the question that came to my mind as I studied this lesson today was this. Are we brave like Elijah was? You know, do we do things to defend the gospel? And I know, so many laws are in place in our country that if we did certain things, we'd be put in jail for it, I guess, these days. But are we brave and stand up? Are there those of us who stand up for the gospel regardless of the consequences? And that came up this week. I don't know, Clint and I were discussing something, and he said, well, that would be the point, where you would have to decide, is it to stand up for the gospel, and sacrifice whatever. And so, there are times in our lives, even today, when it comes to that. Are you going to, in your workplace, are you going to stand up for the gospel and stand up for God? Or are you going to compromise so that you can continue to work and look the other way when things are not being done correctly? It takes an amount of bravery to say, no, I'm gonna stand up and I'm gonna do what's right, regardless. Because that takes a trust in God, doesn't it? That God is going to take care of you through that situation. And just like with Elijah, how bold was this to say, bring 450 of them, and I, Elijah, will be the one. I'll be out there. I'm one person by myself, but I'm saying that my God is more powerful than anything that you 450 people can do. That is a tremendous amount of faith, and knowing he knew God, and he knew that God was powerful enough to do that. We don't often take a stand like that because we don't want to be embarrassed, I guess. And Elijah really put himself out there. If God had chosen not to do that at that time, Elijah would have been humiliated, And we need to think about that in our daily lives. Another thought that came to my mind is, does God give us a message these days? I think that he does, or he tries to, where he tells us, I want you to say this to this person. I think he can be that specific, where he puts it on our heart. This is what I want you to say, or this is the person I want you to go talk to, or this is the thing that I want you to do. And if we will listen, God will give us a message, just like Elijah had a message for King Ahab and went and gave it to him right to his face, and a message for these prophets and a message for the people. He was God's spokesperson in that place at that time. And they had gone far away from God. They were doing terrible things in this idol worship that they were doing, And yet they were the chosen people, a part of the chosen people of God. And that's something to always remember, that, I guess no matter how badly we mess up, if we are one of God's children, there's a way out of it. God has his hand on us. God is watching out for us. But especially, I think we ought to consider how watered down is the gospel in our society today. How watered down have we allowed it to be, that we don't speak out, that we don't give God the glory for speaking as we speak out, against things even. And I think it's something that we should think about this week. So thank you for being with me, and I'll see you next week, and we'll continue to study the life of Elijah in this time. Thank you.